enough. Folks, I'd like to welcome you all here. Thank you for all joining us here tonight. My name is YesForUnity and I'll be the chair for this debate tonight. As a lifelong Irish language activist, I cannot stress the importance of debates and talks such as this tonight. Over the last few years, political developments, not only in Ireland but across the waters in England, have imbued the Irish unity debate with a new level of intensity. At this critical stage of the unity debate, it's imperative that the Irish working class, women, minority groups and such begin to ask what Irish unity can and will do for them. With that, folks, I'd like to introduce our speakers for tonight. We have Colin Harvey, the Queen's University lecturer. We have Stephen Donnan-Dozell, a LGBTQ activist and writer. We have Joe Matthews from the Irish Republican Socialist Party. We have Councillor Michael Goodman from Sinn Féin and Councillor Michael Collins from People Before Profit. With that, I'd like to welcome our first speaker of the night, Colin Harvey from Queen's University.
Thank you very much. I think we're going for 15 minutes each, and not necessarily right, we'll see. Very, very pleased to be here tonight for this discussion, conversation. Probably make clear at the start that I'm speaking this evening in a personal capacity in terms of the current discussion. And with a view really to the question and answer session later, I thought I would just put a few things out there that people in this room and the audience are already familiar with, but just as things to think about in time ahead. I think first of all, for me, I'm myself convinced that we're heading into a period of time over the next decade where I think it's reasonably likely, just as a matter of fact, that the union with Britain is coming to an end. And I think we're entering that phase. And I think with that framework in mind, it's incumbent on anybody and everybody, wherever they stand in this debate, to begin thinking about questions around management and planning and preparation. And over the last couple of years, in a sense, I've been trying to make some of this as boring as possible. Why? Because I think there's a sense in which we do have to get into some of the rather boring technical detail about what this is all going to involve. We'll say a bit more about that later. In terms of framing this, I think it's also important to start with the fact that the right to self-determination belongs to the people of this island. Now, you'll have heard in the last few weeks and months an awful lot of discussion about the role of the Secretary of State and the various provisions of the Northern Ireland Act and the Good Friday Agreement around that. And that is there, right? That's a reality. But before all that, I think it's important to start by underlining that the human right underpinning all this is the right to self-determination. And that belongs to the people of this island alone, without external impediment. And that's the starting point for the discussion. Yes, the Secretary of State gets to trigger the process. Yes, there is a real live debate at the moment around the criteria around that, but the right to self-determination belongs to the people of the island of Ireland. The corollary of that then is something you all know well, which is the principle of consent. And let's just boil down a minute what that means. And I know all the debates, like you, and I know the history, and I know the disagreements and the agreements around all of this. But what that essentially means is this, that the constitutional status of this region is based on consent alone and nothing else. That's the intention. And in the discussion over the last while, there's been an awful lot of focus on those advocating Irish reunification. And you will all know that you can't raise your head in this debate without being asked to provide a detailed case straight away for what the health service would look like, what a range of other things would look like. And I think that's important. But I think what people miss in that is something rather more basic. It's becoming increasingly clear that unionism has lost its majority in this region. And before people skip over that fact, I think we need to pause and reflect on that, because that is hugely and massively significant. It shakes the very foundations of this region. Because the reason why the Secretary of State is required to call a border poll referendum when it looks reasonably likely that a majority would vote for United Ireland isn't because anybody particularly likes giving this to the Secretary of State. It's because when the evidence emerges around that, then the current sovereignty arrangements in this part of the world are de facto illegitimate. And I think that is not really given the attention it needs to have in the current debate. I think there needs to be much more focus on the fact that unionism at the moment has lost its majority, or that has a majority is just scraping over the line, and that's massively significant. I don't need to tell anybody in this room, however, that no matter how many times we point to the Good Friday Agreement provisions, we point to the fact that that is underpinned in the constitutional legal orders of both states. It's underpinned by international law. It was voted on by the people of the island of Ireland. In other words, it should be a normal mainstream thing to say that we can face considerable resistance to even making that case. And what we've seen, I think, in the last few months, last few years, is obstacle after obstacle after obstacle thrown in the path. You know, inventing or putting into the debate additional criteria, building further obstacles and hurdles in the path to reunification. And I think that in itself is really quite disturbing. My view on this is that the starting point for this has to be the agreement process, the agreement that is there. But what really, really worries me is when people start adding new bits and pieces onto that. If we start to get a radical move away from the language there, I think that in itself is fundamentally destabilising here. Just to press that on a bit further, my view is that the opponents of Irish reunification are already mobilising around the process of these referendums and are already working on framing this conversation now. Whatever might be being said publicly, I think work is being done by those who are opposed to Irish reunification to frame the debate around the process leading up to these referendums in particular. And I think there is a bit of a risk that if people aren't alive to that, then some of the harder questions won't be addressed. I'll maybe explain what I mean by that a bit later. One of the themes for tonight is the question of addressing socioeconomic rights. In other events, I've been urging people who are involved in equality, social justice, and human rights struggles to engage in this conversation. And you will know that there's a bit of anxiety and nervousness, I think, in the wider equality and human rights and social justice community in engaging these conversations, because there's a tendency to want to shy away from what are seen as constitutional discussions. And I think that's a massive mistake, because socioeconomic rights are second-class rights on the island of Ireland now, north and south. Basic rights around housing, healthcare, protections for workers are second-class rights, north and south, in the here and now. And what do we know from history? We know from history that if those who are struggling for equality, social justice and human rights absent themselves from these conversations, then they will be locked outside the door when these discussions come to pass. So I think it's absolutely vital that those who want to see the conversation about Irish reunification framed by a commitment to a genuinely new Ireland, a new Ireland where social and economic rights are no longer second-class rights, then they have to engage. And I would urge anybody in this society, anybody on this island who is struggling for equality, human rights and social justice to join the conversation about the future of this island, to become involved, to make sure that rights and equality aren't locked out of the room when this new Ireland gets to be designed. That also doesn't mean, from my perspective, that human rights and equality and social economic rights are things to be addressed, given the title of this evening, in the distant future. That also means that people need to work doubly hard in the here and now to realise socio and economic rights now. I think that's also a risk, that some of the conversations around constitutional change often pitch these things as distant aspirations, something that will arrive when the new Ireland emerges. I think if you believe that socio and economic rights need to be at the heart of the Ireland, then they need to be at the heart of the conversation now. For example, it's my view that there was supposed to be a Bill of Rights flowing out of the Good Friday Agreement. That Bill of Rights was never delivered. The advice that the Human Rights Commission provided included very robust protection for social and economic rights. That advice was ignored by the British government effectively. It's never been implemented. That needs to form part of protecting rights in the here and now, right now. There was supposed to be a Charter of Rights for the island of Ireland flowing from the agreement. That hasn't been delivered either. So in a sense, we're living in, if you like, a cold house for human rights and equality in the here and now. And so while we have to make sure that the conversation about Irish reunification has human rights and equality at its core, we also have to make sure that the conversation right now, the here and now, has to have socioeconomic rights at its core. And just perhaps anticipating question and answers to come, and look forward to hearing your views. Those are just some random reflections. My own view is that when people do use the language of a new Ireland, it has to mean a new Ireland. Irish reunification cannot mean a tweak in the north and a tweak in the south, bolting both on or absorbing one. There has to be a genuine conversation about what was done wrong on both bits of this island, that, make sure that the housing crisis we see in the north and south, the healthcare crisis we see in the north and south, these things are all addressed in a rights framework in the future. And I think there's a very, very, very real risk that if those who are working on human rights and equality in the north stay out of this conversation, they'll be left behind, because I think we're in a decade where this is likely to come to pass. Just a final point I would make is this. If we are entering a phase where over the next decade the union with Britain is likely to come to an end, then that puts a responsibility on all those working for Irish unity to find ways to work together. If we're in the last lap, if touching distance is there in relation to this goal, then I do think there is a need for cooperation and collaboration, of working together, of building coalitions, of trying to find ways to set aside differences to work on achieving that overall objective. So really tonight, what I would say, and I've said this in other venues as well, is really a plea for those who are working towards this goal to find ways to try and work together while recognizing the very real differences while acknowledging all the historical arguments that people have, I think we are entering now really what is a campaign that will lead to referendums. And the key thing is, ultimately, to put it bluntly, if you believe in Irish reunification, it's about winning those referendums north and south. It's about working out how you do that, and it's about working out how social and economic rights are mainstreamed into that discussion. So again, the plea this evening is to find ways to work together through coalitions, speaking to people who, let's be clear, people who know how to win referendums on this island need to be at the core of that discussion. Just a final point. I do think we are now entering a new phase in this discussion, and the new phase is going to raise detailed questions, right? Questions like, who gets to vote in a referendum in the North on unity? Do we have a shared view on that? Is it going to be the Scottish approach, 16 plus, or is it going to be a more restrictive approach? What's the question going to be in a unity referendum in the North? I think these questions are going to start coming up thick and fast. And if those advocating for Irish reunification have 55 or 32 different answers to those questions, I think we may well look rather foolish. So I think there is a need for collaboration, to working together, to working through some of these questions, to try and make sure that yes, where there are disagreements, acknowledge those, but where people can work together and be on the same page on some of those questions, they should try to do that. Thank you very much.